Okay.
All right, everyone. Thank you for coming. My name is Nick Babbitt. I'm faculty in the Department of Natural Resource Management, Environmental Sciences. And it's my pleasure to introduce Brandon Hurd and his Master's of Science project presentation. Known Brandon for a couple of years, and he's a really hard worker, a really inquisitive mind, curious, and super organized. So he's been a pleasure to work with. And I look forward to hearing this presentation. Thanks.
All right. Hi, guys. Oh, hello.
Could you make it so you don't see the people?
Yes.
Thank you.
Of course. Okay. Cool. That looks good. Thanks so much for coming. Is that all right here? Is that? Okay. Yeah. Thanks so much for coming. Thank you guys online. Really appreciate it. Let me just check one thing. Cool. Yeah. Thanks so much. And so I worked with Professor Nick Babin, and I installed an agroforestry orchard on Cal Poly at the experimental farm to represent Californian Mediterranean plant communities. Oh, there we go. So I'm just going to address two issues. We probably all know there's a lot of issues that come with conventional agriculture. So specifically in California, we're depleting a lot of our groundwater through overusing our fresh water, where we use 80% of our fresh water just for agriculture. And additionally, there's a lot of soil erosion and nitrogen runoff, which creates hypoxic zones, which and will then create areas where there's not a lot of life that can exist in these hypoxic areas, particularly in the Gulf of Mexico with the Mississippi River runoff. And then also on the other side of the spectrum, there's problems with passive conservation. And what I mean by passive conservation is that when we're not interacting with our environment, just letting things go and just saying, don't touch that, you create issues like back in the day when there was a lot of resistance to controlled burns, and there would be a buildup of fuel and causing more larger fires. Additionally, there's an overpopulation of species with invasive species if we don't interact with those. And we're also, I would say in general, losing connection to our land and the plants and animals around us, where you look at Native Americans and they would rely on these species and not overharvest because they wanted to come back next year, things of that nature. So then just to connect those two, there's those two underlying issues, but they are connected here. Kind of the heart of my project is to connect farmers and environmentalists, where ideally they're on the same playing field. And so in traditional ecological knowledge, like I mentioned with the Native Americans, they really relied on these things. They would interact with their environment through cultural burning, pruning, saving seeds, etc. So there was no difference between their land management and their agriculture. And so with the Western lens, we see this in the lens of agroecology. So with that said, we mimic our agricultural systems as our ecosystems. So we're looking at the biomes and whatnot, and agroforestry is that, but in the lens with woody trees and shrubs. So we're just looking at agricultural systems and seeing it as a natural ecosystem. So when we're talking about ecosystem mimicry, it's important to talk about our climate. So we're in a Mediterranean climate. And so here, if you're unfamiliar, here's the 5 Mediterranean climates of the world. So ideally, we could all use native species in our agriculture, but again, it's really hard to do that. It's really rare to see that at all. But with this being said, it expands our network of what we can choose from when we want to plant things responsibly and sustainably. So with that said, we can really conserve water this way by planting things that are acclimated. And additionally, with the perennial tree crops, they have deep tap roots that allow them to establish and use less water, as well as like nutrients, and there's less tillage because they're perennials and not annuals. So we can focus on soil health and carbon farming. So with all that, we decided to do an agroforestry demonstration orchard to show people the possibilities. So the research questions that I had here was, can we demonstrate an orchard that we can pull water off and really limit our water usage in the orchard? And can we show the value of this and so that other farmers might adopt similar practices? So there's a lot of USDA approved methods that can be funded. So a lot of these practices can get grant funding. There's a big US grant for $60 million recently for the USDA. And lastly, we just want the space to be a open lab. It's already a lab space, so signage and collaboration. One moment. Okay. And yeah, so here's just an overview of the project. So these are just the 5 steps. This is the site at the experimental farm we chose. I'll talk about each one in a sec. So I did a brief GIS survey, so nothing crazy. This is the slope. It's going to the northeast corner. We got a low so-so loam, nothing wild. And then we did a soil test, randomized digging samples, and it came back. We just found that we needed more gypsum and nitrogen. So here's the field right after a mowing. And as we started developing with Ag Ops helping us out a lot. So this is after Ag Ops at Cal Poly helped us to build our terraces. So if you look carefully, there's a low point here and a high point here on the right side. And the purpose of that is it's all on contour. So there's 5 rows, they're all on terraces. The goal is to slow, spread, and sink water. And so the trees are planted on the berms to limit root rot while we have those big rain events, because this does fill up with water to get deep infiltration to the tree's roots. So just photo of throwing some gypsum in cover crop. So here's the cover crop coming up. The swale's holding that water, getting deep infiltration. This is December 2021. And then just the orchard design. So the requirements for each crop, the goal is that they would each be agriculturally productive, as well as climate analogous, for us particularly drought tolerant, and then functionally diverse. So a polyculture of things, particularly nitrogen fixing and pollinators. And then these are the communities that I chose to focus on that are more prevalent around us. So each row will represent one of those communities. So here's a sign that I will eventually post in front of the agroforestry orchard. So each of these rows are what I did plant. So it's hard to see where you guys are at, but the species in bold are planted. The species that are not are just other good ideas. So we have an oak savanna row where we're planting natives, but also climate analogous trees and shrubs that are agriculturally productive or useful. So we got oak savanna, foothill mixed coniferous forest, and I chose foothill because we don't have the montane climate, and then mixed evergreen forests, Mediterranean chaparral. So that one and the oak savanna are the most close to our to our microclimate here. And then lastly, desert scrub. So we can grow all those things here, and just to exemplify what we can do and show farmers. So maybe a farmer is in the southern Central Valley and he's frustrated because he doesn't have enough water. Soil's not so great. He's trying to grow like apples and whatnot. But if he came here and saw that he's here on the map, he sees these things in his native ecosystem. He could also grow jujube and potentially date palms and jelly palms. Also, maybe he doesn't even know, but mesquite is edible. And prickly pear is edible, and those are great crops that require very little water. Then here's the 5 plant communities again. And this chart is each one. I just made a little bit of a bigger list where there's the dominant species on the left, then other community members, and then on the right column is non-native climate analogous plants. So other plants in and other plants that are non-native that are also agriculturally productive or useful. So I'm just going to just talk about one species or one system for each row. So this is the row of the oak woodland. Agroforestry model would be the oak dehesa. So the dehesa or the montado in Portugal. This is just a system. It's a silvopastoral system. What that means is we're just grazing animals, particularly pigs in this case, underneath these oak trees. So it's an agricultural model where we're almost not altering our ecosystem at all. So these are just native oak trees to Spain and Portugal in this region. And so, this is mainly Quercus suber and Quercus ilex forests. However, on our plot, we planted 3 Quercus rotundifolia, which is also common there. And that tree is super special, very low tannins. You can roast the acorns and eat them. which also creates a bigger culture of balanophagy, where culture of eating and loving acorns in the southwest of Spain and Portugal, also in Korea. And of course, just can't, I need to say the Native Americans, of course, we're on Chumash land and they've been doing this for thousands of years. So obviously it's super important. We can even use the species that are all around us, and I do every year. And in the back, I have a little mini museum and acorn cookies for you guys. Yeah, next row is the mixed coniferous, the foothill row. Hey, Deirdre. So this is the second row. So this is representing mixed coniferous forests, foothills. And so in this row, we're just talking about, I want to focus on chestnuts. So they're not coniferous, but they live in the foothill climates there and do really well, like in the Santa Cruz Mountains here. There's me and the enormous chestnut that doesn't have any irrigation. And also there's just enormous, beautiful trees. Those are the American chestnuts. I won't get into that now, but they have the blight and they're not doing so hot. So in general, I'm just focusing on the European chestnuts, which still do really well. So in this area, we're talking about the mixed evergreens, the third row. These are represented by temperate fruit trees, so just traditional stone fruits, apples, etc. So as far as stone fruits, mainly it's Prunus genus. So our native analog is Prunus virginiana. Here's its distribution. When we talk about Mediterranean climate fruit trees, this is kind of what we think of with pomegranates and figs and mulberries and whatnot. So in this area, I just want to talk about the carob tree, which is a really cool native chocolate kind of thing. So it's also a nitrogen fixer. So it's really good to introduce that. And as you can see, the distribution is it's in every single Mediterranean climate, so really adapted. And then lastly, the desert scrub row. So in this row, I just wanted to talk about just cool desert trees that are beneficial. So like mesquite, this is the jelly palm, jujube could be in this row. So these are just very drought tolerant trees that do well in the Southwest. And so here's my design. So you can see each of the 5 rows. So this is the top row, the desert row, Mediterranean chaparral, the mixed evergreen, temperate fruit trees, and then the foothill mixed coniferous with the chestnuts, and then the oak savanna with the Quercus rotundifolia sweet acorn oaks. And again, so we're trying to represent different methods of agroforestry through the USDA practices. So the rows are all spaced 25 feet apart, and the trees are spaced 20 feet apart. So they're fairly widely spaced to represent a savanna that requires less water. And then the widely spaced terraces allow us to hold a lot of water. And also there's tractor access. So we could do mechanical alley cropping as an agroforestry method. And we're slowly developing a windbreak. And there's kind of a mock riparian buffer area that we can develop later. And then again, it's a polyculture, drought tolerant orchard. So we'll pull water off eventually. And there are intercropping with nitrogen fixing trees like the mesquite, and like ceanothus is a great native one. Sea berry is a really cool, unique permaculture one that has edible berries. And also intercropping with native plants on the undersides, on the slopes of those berms, just to show what that community might look like if it was only natives. So then irrigation regime, each one has a different irrigation regime. The desert row obviously has the least water needs. And then the mixed evergreen and foothill coniferous forest row has the most. But the goal is to taper off all of them eventually, maybe just a supplemental watering and really drought prone areas or times where it's super hot heat waves. So we have the irrigation system in, so we can use it if we need to. The goal is to show that we don't rely on it in the future. And so here's the planting. I had a great group of pals, some of these folks here, and we planted in 2 days, dug a bunch of holes, planted all the trees, about 40 trees in those 2 days. And then just based on the soil test, we added organic feather meal for the nitrogen, 4 cups per tree, and gypsum, 6 cups per tree. And we used less for the native plants. So planting, here's the row at the beginning of the summer. It's a little dry, but looking pretty good. And then here's last month. So this is after a mow, so it's looking really good. The trees are deciduous, so it's hard to see the leaves, but it's coming in pretty well. The weeds are overgrown right now because of all the crazy rain. And then because these trees are so long living, the oaks and the chestnuts can live hundreds of years. We're really hoping that people can continuously take this energy and keep moving with it. So I broke down a management plan for the next people after me, just with seasonal tasks, like what you can do in the winter, summer, spring, like grafting or pruning, and where the irrigation is, practical things like that. And then the agroforestry decision matrix I made for landowners who see this thing and they say, I want to do that. I wonder what's best for me. So they could fill out this chart here on the light column. You can input 1 to 10 based on your priorities of these land use priorities here. So at the top, we have the yield for food and whatnot. So that's kind of the most common. That's the #1 priority for most farmers. But also maybe reducing water is a priority, and maybe reducing fertilizer or nitrogen runoff. Maybe you want biodiversity, maybe you want carbon sequestration. So those are all in there. This column, the first column, so basically from the left to the right, it gets more sustainable. So the far left is just a conventional orchard, say an almond orchard, conventionally grown. And then the next goes drought tolerant, oak savanna, or sorry, drought tolerant savanna style. And then you're intercropping, et cetera, moving to the right. And then lastly, there's kind of the ultimate agroforestry model. And then farthest to the right is just an actively managed native ecosystem. So next steps for outreach and whatnot. So again, this space is currently used for labs. Professor Nick Babin uses it a lot. CETA is doing research, and Dr. Williams as well. And so, yeah, we just want people to be using the space again and showing that they care about it. And I see in the future working with people like the NRCS or the RCD, we could be growing plants for them here. We could be showing their clients what these agroforestry methods be. And we'd have a lot more student hands-on experience with industry. I think it'd be really cool. But on the contrary, we do need more support from the school on these type of things. There is risk. Well, basically, they're planning to put a water treatment facility there, so that's not so great. So we're hoping we can save parts of the farm, or just yeah, try to see how we can collaborate in some kind of way and make it work. But yeah, so we're trying to reach out to these farmers too and kind of change their minds, and it's hard to do that with facts. You don't really change anyone's mind. The Desmond Tutu said, "Do not raise your voice, improve your argument." And so it's kind of like talking to a fish in water. So the farmer has been told by his community and his grandfather about these practices that he's doing or she's doing, and basically to connect with that person, we need to think emotionally, tell stories, show examples like this, and just touch on the more human aspects rather than saying you're doing it wrong. People don't like hearing that, so just trying to connect with those people. And then thank you guys so much. Yeah, especially to these people here on the list. And if you want more information, here's a QR code for my grad paper. Thank you. Any questions? Hey.
Yeah, so did you have an expectation in mind of how much rain we were going to get this year? And did you have to kind of adjust?
No, yeah, last year I was like, oh, it's so dry, this is perfect, like it's gonna be a great example. And then this year it's like flooding all the time, and I don't know, it's hard to convince people right now, but I'm sure we'll have more drought. And also a lot of these plants are still acclimated for both flood and drought, so I imagine they're not unhappy. Maybe a couple of them are unhappy, but yeah, we'll still be grateful. They're all getting established. It's actually really great because I planted all the native plants right before all the rain, so they're all getting established and probably super happy. Yeah, but good question.
For agroforestry, at what point does there's a certain amount of diversity that you want in the agroforestry a certain number of species for a number of acres. On that list that you had, from going from less to more, I mean, I'm just curious to hear what you think about, like, you know, a farmer wants to incorporate agroforestry. Is it quote unquote agroforestry if he's using these Mediterranean plants, but they're not exactly biodiverse selection? But,
Yes, are you talking about this list here?
sure, or the one where it's like, where you're making decisions.
Oh, yeah, the decision matrix.
Yeah.
Yeah, so agroforestry is kind of a broad term. It's basically just using woody species. So like you could call a normal orchard an agroforestry orchard, but it's not necessarily sustainable unless you are using drought-tolerant plants like Mediterranean plants, and even then you can take it a step farther and intercrop. So like that book over there, the creating a forest garden. Like if you can think of it on a garden scale, it's much easier to make it really natural forest look. But for like an orchard, even the one that I planted, they're pretty spread out. It looks somewhat conventional, even though it is biodiverse, but still using the swales and using nitrogen fixers and stuff like that. So, yeah, but yeah, so basically it's all agroforestry, but you can choose the level of sustainability. Yeah.
Technical. Incorporating trees and crops, or trees and crops and animals, or trees and animals. So you're incorporating trees and some
Okay.
by having all those other crops besides the tree orchard crop. That makes sense.
Okay. I'm just going to repeat that for people on Zoom. So Professor Babin just said, so the tree defining agroforestry, it includes trees and crops, or trees and animals. So it has to include at least two things. So a woody species plus one other thing.
I know it's early days in it, but did you find, I'm thinking of the service trees or the ecological function trees. Have you found a nitrogen fixer that seems to be establishing well, doing well, that you're, or conversely, something you found in your research that you didn't incorporate, but what do you think are some good potential nitrogen fixing trees to incorporate nitrogen agroforestry?
Yeah, ceanothus is great. We see that everywhere. Lupin, Acmaspon glaber, the deerweed. So those are all great native ones. And then I found that the acacia is amazing. We saw that when I gave the tour to your class. The acacia is already like this big. I planted it when it was this tall. It's kind of crazy to see it. It's pretty much quadrupled at least in size in a year. Yeah, the mesquite's not super happy yet. I'm hoping when it's dry and hot, they'll bloom again, because it was somewhat deciduous and it came back. So I think that'll keep coming back. But again, that's a desert scrub, so not totally. We can represent it here, but it's not as happy as it would be in the desert. But the seaberry has been surprisingly happy. I'm starting to see it come back to life. I've seen where I got it from is from Josh Carmichael at Carmichael Environmental, and it's just growing like a weed. Not invasively, but it's super happy. It grows kind of like a blackberry, which is cool because it's edible and fixing nitrogen where it's moving. Yeah. Sarah?
I have a question about like this transition to like conventional agriculture being adopted by conventional farmers. I think the first one is like, is there research being done to increase yields of these, like specifically for production, like a hybridizing plant, and it's like something like that. And then also kind of in that part of the like sustainable practices are beneficial if we have more not like let's say we have, you know, like rows that both for the chestnut with maybe one is the level of sustainability, like is that still like analogous to composing or is it sort of
So are you saying are you asking if there's studies that have been done to see like the increased yield with intercropping, or?
Yeah,
Okay.
Not like a farmer and actually like
Yeah, I think it's worth it. So, I mean, especially if it's a nitrogen fixer. I think if you can just plant nitrogen fixing plants, like actually at Mount Olive Farm in Paso Robles, they have a really inspiring model too. But if you look at their orchards, they have their fruit trees and they almost always mix nitrogen fixing trees. Like I think in Paso, the mesquite grows better. They have a few really big mesquite trees in Paso. And they intercrop with like acacia and things like that. And the sea berry, they have big sea berry trees almost, really cool. But yeah, I don't, there are studies that show that nitrogen fixing, increasing yield, and compare, like if you see a savanna with and without nitrogen fixers. So I don't know a lot about the dynamics, like how close they need to be to the nitrogen fixer, or if it needs to be like chopped to release some of its root exudates and stuff like that. Cause it's, yeah. So I don't know the details, but there are studies that look into nitrogen fixing, increasing yield. But yeah, just generally like having any nitrogen in the ground will help plants. So if you can use it naturally, like in a native ecosystem, there's no fertilizer, you know, and all the plants are stoked because they're acclimated and also they have nitrogen fixing plants around them. And then to touch on the first question, so yeah, wondering if there's like studies done to improve the yield of these drought tolerant trees and shrubs. So with the oaks, for example, there are people in the southwest of Spain and Portugal who are taking the Quercus rotundifolia, the sweet acorn oak, and they're taking species they like and grafting it. So you can graft oaks. And this is only one company. I don't think it's common, but I would love to see it more common because if we could replace all the almond orchards in the Central Valley with sweet acorn oaks, that would make me very joyful. And additionally, too, just think about the chestnut forest. If that was on all the areas in the foothills surrounding the Central Valley, you could be in these forests of acclimated plants rather than these kind of deserts of forced agricultural practices. But yeah, we do want to inspire farmers to like see it's possible. So like you don't want to overwhelm them and say it's a lot of labor and financing to like plant 1 million species and like do all these crazy things that they've never heard of. And so yeah, just starting with 2 species, like throwing in a nitrogen fixer and seeing if that works, maybe just trying like one small plot of land. I would recommend just like doing a pilot for them and yeah, just try like maybe like a 1/4 acre and see if it works and if they like it. And yeah, I would say the swales though are, for me, like earthscaping is the first step, because if you can hold the water on your property, you're doing good for your neighbors to help increase the groundwater recharge if possible. And additionally, you're saving water for those trees so they get deep infiltration, kind of like irrigating by furrows. A lot of old school farmers use the furrow irrigation, and they could probably relate to the swales in that way. Yeah. Anyone else? Thanks, guys. Thank you. Oh yeah, and just also I added a few slides at the end. So here's my business card. If you guys want to look, get some acorn cookies, also I'll clean up all your acorns for you if you're in North County. This is the sweet acorn oak. Just out, I want to do agroforestry with these sweet acorn oaks, and I'm really excited. A bunch of them popped up. And then just eating acorns. I make them every year with valley oaks. And here's some volunteers at a workshop. I got to be on the radio too, so it was cool. My acorn cookies. If you want an acorn cookie, they're in that red tin. And yeah, thanks again.